One morning in a quiet neighborhood, a child is sitting in a parked car in front of a house. Suddenly, the windows break and flames burst from the quickly burning home. Years later, Nina Street Claire is preparing lunch for her kids, Brandon and April, with their nanny, Isabel. Her husband, Stuart, a doctor, enters and kisses her on the cheek. Nina doesn't return the gesture and tells the kids they need to leave for school. At her job as an illustrator at a medical publications office, Nina answers a call from Stuart, who says he'll be working late. Her friend Karen notices Nina's downcast mood and asks if she's having problems with her husband. Nina insists everything is fine and doesn't want to discuss it. Meanwhile, Amy, a radiology technician, flirts with Stuart in the X-ray room. Though he jokingly rejects her advances, they're interrupted by Dr. Miriam, who teases Stuart about already having someone else in mind. Later, Stuart follows Miriam to a storage room where they kiss, revealing they've been having an affair. Stuart tells Miriam they can't keep seeing each other because he doesn't want to lose his family, though Miriam is upset. That afternoon, Nina calls her grandmother's house, but the neighbor, Mary, answers. She recognizes Nina's voice and calls her Marcia, hinting at a past Nina has tried to leave behind. Mary tells Nina that her grandmother is at Mercy Park Hospital after having a heart attack 2 days ago. Suddenly, Nina overhears her brother, Drew, asking Mary to convince Nina to come home. When Nina asks if Drew is there with her, Mary lies. After the call, Drew texts the number, but it shows as withheld. At work, Nina tells Karen she has to leave town for personal reasons. She goes home to pack, not wanting to lose her family. Nina tells Isabel she's leaving for a work trip. Once she arrives in New York, she puts her bag in a rental car and removes the license plate. At Mercy Park Hospital, Nina calls ahead to make sure no one is in the room with her grandmother. Inside the room, Nina gently wakes her grandmother, Frida, and apologizes for being away for so long. Frida reminds her that they both agreed staying apart was best. Frida also mentions Nina's brother is at the house, which Nina figured out after talking to Mary. Frida shares that she won't be able to stay in the house forever and feels sorry for the neighbor, who is completely in love with her grandson. Nina asks about Drew, and Frida says he's still devoted to her and never stopped looking for her. Before leaving, Nina promises Frida she'll take her home when she's better. At the station, a nurse tells Nina that Drew knows she's there. Panicked, Nina rushes out through the fire exit and hurries to her car. Drew spots Nina driving away and follows her. Even though the license plate is gone, he notices the rental car logo. Later, he tricks the car rental worker and breaks into the office. He steals Nina's info and finds out she lives in Chicago. While driving home, Nina calls the rental company to say she'll return the car at their Chicago location. The next morning, Stuart greets Nina and tells her she can't just leave for work on short notice. Nina responds, pointing out that it's no different from when he has to fill in for a colleague at the hospital. At dinner, Nina gives her children the gifts she brought from New York. Later, in bed, Stuart and Nina enjoy each other's company. Stuart says it was nice to have dinner as a family and promises to be more present. Nina tells him she doesn't want to lose their family, so Stuart vows he'll never cheat on her again. Meanwhile, Drew watches Isabel through the kitchen window from outside. The next day, he introduces himself to Stuart at the hospital cafeteria. During lunch, Karen mentions that Isabel told her Nina's trip to New York wasn't for work. Nina doesn't want to discuss it and says she needs to go to the hospital. She adds that the past is something she's chosen to leave behind. Karen then asks how things are going with Stuart, and Nina replies that they're improving slowly. At the same time, Drew finds out that Nina never told Stuart about him or their grandmother. He shows Stuart a picture of himself and Nina. When Stuart asks why Nina didn't mention her family, Drew thinks it's because of his troubled past. He explains that he spent time in juvenile detention for killing a guy in high school who used to bully Nina. Stuart asks how Drew is doing now, and Drew says he's fine. When asked how long it's been since he last saw Nina, Drew replies 15 years, when she was in college. Stuart invites Drew to their house that evening. Later, Stuart scolds Nina for keeping this secret from him for so long. Nina tells him that inviting Drew over was a mistake because trouble follows him. Stuart tries to assure her that Drew has changed, but Nina insists he doesn't know her brother, and she goes to grab a gun. Soon after, Isabel lets Drew into the house, but Nina stops him at the door, pointing the gun. She tells him to leave, but Drew swears he's changed and just wants a chance to be a family again. Nina reminds him that the last time she gave him a chance, her college boyfriend Brent disappeared. Drew, surprised, says he can't believe she still thinks he killed Brent, especially since he saw him a few years ago at a racetrack in Florida. The next day, Nina meets with George, a private investigator, and asks him to check her brother's background for any arrest warrants. She also asks him to find out if her car is still where it should be. Nina admits she's not sure if she'll ever get her brother back, but she still has doubts about Brent, her missing boyfriend. In the office, Karen overhears Nina talking to her grandmother and asks why Nina never mentioned her family. Nina explains that it's complicated because of her brother's troubled past. Meanwhile, Drew looks at an apartment for rent in town. Later, Nina notices that Isabel received a bouquet from Drew. Isabel insists they only spoke once, but Nina warns her to stay away from him. The next day, George tells Nina that her brother's last arrest was 8 years ago, but the charges were dropped. He believes Drew has turned his life around and asks if Drew ever used other names. Nina says she doesn't know. Then Nina asks about Brent, and George informs her that Brent now owns a car dealership in Fort Lauderdale, is married, and has 4 kids. That evening, Stuart thinks they've learned enough to believe Drew has changed, and the couple agrees to give him a chance. The next day, the family is hanging out by the pool, and Brandon asks Drew to toss a football. Drew accidentally falls into the water, and Nina remembers he can't swim, so she jumps in to help. To her surprise, Drew says he learned how to swim. Later, Drew mentions he married a woman named Tammy Sue Engelke, but they separated. Nina jokes that Drew has never had a real job. Drew says he makes good money playing cards and betting on sports, and invites Stuart to a poker game he set up. Nina reluctantly agrees to let him go, though she still thinks it's a bad idea. The next day, George tells Nina he couldn't find any record of Drew marrying someone named Tammy Sue Engelke and confirms Drew has never had a regular job. Nina decides she'll try to find out if Drew has used any aliases. Later, she visits Drew's apartment and points out that he picked a place with lots of light, implying he's still afraid of the dark. She also realizes his apartment is right across from their house, but Drew insists it's a coincidence. However, when Nina looks through a telescope at his window, she sees that it's aimed directly at their backyard. In the kitchen, Nina notices the apartment keys on the counter, but when she turns around, Drew quickly pockets them. She offers to get more beer, but when she checks for the keys again, they're gone. That night, Drew gives Stuart some poker tips before they enter the building. Meanwhile, Nina, with George's help, breaks into Drew's apartment. In a drawer, she finds a cigar box with old family pictures, but the faces of their parents are scratched out. Just then, a woman arrives to drop off a package, so Nina hides in the closet. After she leaves, Nina checks Drew's coat pockets and finds several fake IDs with different names. At the poker game, Stuart wins a large amount of money, making Rivas angry. To calm things down, Drew says it's almost midnight and they need to leave. Outside, Stuart thanks Drew for the good time, then receives a message from Miriam saying she misses him. After Stuart drives away, Drew returns to the building and pays the men for letting Stuart win. Stuart enters Miriam's apartment, and they share a moment of closeness. The next day, Drew follows Karen into an art supply store and introduces himself as Russ. He asks her out and she gives him her card. Drew calls Nina and tells her that next time Stuart is invited out, he should make sure he doesn't come home at 3 a.m. Nina is confused because Drew knows Stuart left the poker game at midnight, leading him to suspect that Stuart might be cheating on her. Later, George tells Nina that the fake IDs aren't solid proof, and Nina admits she's probably being too paranoid. Meanwhile, Drew surprises Isabel in the bathroom and they kiss, revealing they've been secretly seeing each other. Afterward, Drew asks Isabel if she knows if Stuart and Nina are having problems. Isabel shares that she thinks Stuart is cheating with someone from the hospital and that she sometimes hears Nina crying at night. The next day, Drew follows Stuart and sees him flirting with Amy. That night, Amy drives out of the parking lot, unaware that her brake fluid is leaking. Soon after, the faulty brakes cause her to crash into a truck at an intersection. At dinner, Stuart gets a call from the hospital about an emergency. Drew steps away to update Rivas on Stuart's location. He then asks Nina about Amy, and she casually says she works at the hospital, leaving Drew suspicious. In the parking lot, Rivas confronts Stuart. Later, a doctor tells Stuart that Amy has died. Isabel answers a call for Nina, which Drew sees is from a private investigator. The next day, George tells Nina that Brent Porter isn't her old boyfriend, but a body found near the campus matched Brent's DNA. He also found that Drew used the alias James Carter and married a woman named Tammy Sue, who disappeared after they wed. George promises to check Drew's car for evidence. Later, Nina updates Stuart, but thinks it's best if they pretend everything is normal, especially since Drew believes he took care of the situation with the other woman. Just then, Drew arrives, and when Nina leaves, Stuart confronts him about Rivas. Stuart tells Drew he could have reported the attack but chose not to, not wanting to make things worse. That night, George follows Drew's car through the city. When Drew stops at a flower shop, George doesn't notice Drew open the car door and point a weapon at him. Drew gets in the car and asks George if he's working for Nina. George denies it, but as he tries to grab the weapon, he's shot in the leg. George promises to tell Nina whatever Drew wants, but Drew shoots him in the head, ending his life. Later, Drew goes on a date with Karen and makes up a story about a friend whose spouse is being unfaithful. Karen shares that her friend's partner is also cheating and, thanks to Drew's leading questions, reveals that the other person's name is Miriam. The next day, Nina sees her brother with Karen outside her office. Karen explains she didn't know Drew was Nina's brother. Nina asks if Karen heard about Stuart's affair, and Karen apologizes, thinking it was just a date. Nina calls the hospital but can't reach her husband or the other woman. A nurse tells Nina she saw Stuart in a storage room. Nina walks in and catches them. She tells Stuart their marriage is over and calls Isabel to keep Drew out of the house. Drew figures it out, ties up Isabel, and takes the kids. At the theater, Drew tells the kids to wait while he runs errands. Nina looks through Stuart's notebook for the other woman's address. Meanwhile, Stuart and Miriam prepare to leave town. Nina calls Drew asking why he's causing trouble. He replies that she always picks the wrong people. As Stuart and Miriam are about to leave, Drew stops them with a gun. She tells Drew she ended things with Stuart, but Drew insists someone must pay. He pushes Miriam, but Nina shoots him in the leg. She tells Stuart and Miriam to run while she comforts Drew, who asks if she'll save him again, like when they were kids. Nina pretends not to understand, but Drew reveals he knows what happened when they were kids. To protect him from their abusive father, Nina hit their dad with a frying pan, and they ran away, spending the night in the car. Nina secretly turned on the stove, and Drew stayed awake, fearing their father would cause a fire. Nina admits her mistake and says it's haunted her. Drew thanks her for saving him, explaining his overprotectiveness. Later, their mother finds Brandon and April at the theater, and they finish the movie together. A few weeks later, Nina brings her kids to meet their great-grandmother, Frida.
Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and stay connected with us.